We are a classic passage. There are so many different passages in the Bible that talk about money. In fact, some people, and I'll freely admit I'm a little leery of this because I've heard more than one person, and my guess is somebody said it once and a whole bunch of people started repeating it. But somebody's made the point that Jesus talks more about money than he does any other subject. And the reason I'm a little leery of that is it's kind of, what do you mean by that? A lot of times he's talking about other issues and he'll use money or giving to illustrate a point about something else. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, he refers to giving, he refers to money and our attitudes towards money and giving a lot, and as well as the whole Bible emphasize this, because it's one of those things like your words. Your words betray your heart. You know, you may say, I usually don't say things like that. Well, it didn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of, it's like fruit on the tree. Well, giving's one of those kind of things too. This is, in the New Testament, probably the classic place to look on the subject of giving, because here we've got 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 together, and they do go together. And these two chapters put together have a great deal to say on the subject of giving. Here are some of the passages that kind of we're going to make reference to. So I just wanted to have them up here on the board. When you think of Acts chapter 5, what do you usually think of? What takes place in Acts chapter 5? What's the couple's name? Ananias and Sapphira. There's a lot about giving there, but there's also some details. I don't want to just beat us over the head on some stuff that we already know. But I do want to make sure that we kind of clarify and better understand some of these things. One of the reasons we're going to make reference to Acts chapter 5 is, do you remember what Peter said to Ananias and Sapphira? They lied to the Holy Spirit, but what did he say about their money? He said, when you have this, he said what? It's yours. You didn't have to give it. This is a free will thing. It's a decision that you get to make. Now, having said that, I like diagrams. Sorry. I just do. Look at this. A lot of people have this idea that, well, I'll start with this one. Because unfortunately, a lot of people have this idea that not all Christians have to give. I'm hoping that you'll see with me at the end of today that passages like Romans chapter 12, people might think this, but that's not what the Bible teaches. It's also not this. Do you understand what I mean by this? If this circle represents Christians, and this circle represents people who give, I don't mind this circle, because you know what? Some people who give are Christians. Some people who give doesn't necessarily mean they're Christians, right? But this is the problem I have with this circle. So I'm gonna knock that one out too. I think the conclusion we're gonna come to is right here. Not everybody who gives is necessarily a Christian, but you know what? If you're a Christian, somehow, some way, proportionately, you're gonna give. Does that make sense? Do you understand this diagram? Okay. I wanted to put these up on the board too, in case you wanted to maybe mark your Bible or get ready to go there, because I'm hoping we're going to have time to look up some of these. Leviticus 5, Romans 12, Luke chapter 6, what Jesus says there. Haggai, the first chapter, extremely interesting what he says. Usually people go to Malachi when you want to talk about giving, because God challenges his people and he talks about the tithe. What does tithe mean? 10%. It means 10%. It means 10%. What we are talking about here is not tithing. It's not 10%. Then what is it? Well, I hope to answer that as we go through this. We're down to like verse 3, but let's go ahead and start with verse 1 just to get the context here. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, and now, brothers, I want you to know about the grace that God has given to the Macedonian churches. We already pointed this out. What churches do you know in Macedonia?
Philippi,
probably example number one. We've got Thessalonica, we've got Berea. That'd be the churches of Macedonia to the north of where Corinth is. And Corinth's going to be in the area of Achaia. Okay? And he's going to make reference to that. Verse 2, out of the most severe trial, out of overflowing joy and extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. You've got an interesting mix here. Happy, but at the same time, they don't have much in the way of resources. So we're not talking necessarily about a huge gift or people who are very wealthy. In fact, this is a classic example of somebody who doesn't have much, but they gave a lot. I love the way the Apostle Paul is approaching this subject, by the way. I think there's some wisdom here in approaching just about any subject, the way he's approaching this subject. Instead of saying, here's what you need to do. How does he start up this subject off? Instead of saying, here's what you need to do, he says, let me give you an example. Let me tell you a story. Here's some people, they don't have much. And yet, look what they're doing. Hopefully, that's going to not only get across the same lesson on giving, but it's going to also maybe emotionally encourage them too. It's kind of like, wow, if they can do it, why can't I do it? I don't know about you guys. I apologize if you hear the same old stories from me all the time. But I'm emotionally moved by stories from the mission field. Because we're talking about people who've got like nothing. And I don't mean to embarrass my dad, but I grew up in his household, so a lot of my stories come out of this. But one of the stories that the first dozen or two times I shared this with other people, I couldn't hardly stop from crying just telling other people this story. And if I get the details wrong, I'll let him set it straight later on. But my mom and dad got to go to India. More than once, I guess. But there was this one time they went, it was a month-long trip. They went to Starkeys that time. Anyway, I was a young guy, I didn't get to go. Mom and dad went. When they were there was one of these villages that they were visiting. And a couple in the village wanted the privilege of feeding the missionary who came to visit and teach and preach in their church. And so they literally went into this structure that most of us would not refer to as a home. It'd be more like a metal shed, set on dirt floors. And you know what kind of plates they brought the food out on? Big old leaf. That was there's a dining table, there's the leaf. And some food. Don't remember the details other than what's in my mind is and I've had a little bit of this kind of experience on the mission field. You say the missionary prayer. You know what the missionary prayer is? God, I don't know what this is. please don't let me get sick, but I don't want to offend these people, so I'm going to eat this and try to be grateful. Say the missionary prayer. You don't know exactly what's there, but you go ahead and eat it. Here's the part that moves me. Not David Morris, but his dad, Art Morris, at the time. Art Morris later on said that couple probably went an entire week without eating to save up enough money so that they could have the privilege of giving something like that. Wow. Yeah, stuff like that, it's kind of like, I'd eat every little grain, and I'd try to be as grateful and as thankful as possible. But that's exactly the kind of illustration he's giving here. These people couldn't afford it, and yet, boy, did they give. They give. So I think he's kind of motivational here, but there's so much content to what he's going to be saying. Let's get on. He gives the example, first of all, of the Macedonian churches giving generously out of extreme poverty, and it created great joy. That's another part that gets me. It's not like, oh boy, this really hurt. No, it didn't hurt. It made them feel like, yes. It just made their day. Verse 3, for I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Okay, now later on, one of the principles we're going to see is God expects us to give not what we don't have, but He expects us to give proportionally based on what we do have. Now, having said that, we'll get to that verse later on, okay? Having said that, what does he say here? He's not saying you have to do this. He's just throwing this out as an example. You know what they did? They gave more, as much as they were able, and beyond. What does that mean? How can you give more than what you're able to give? Okay, I think that's an example of what we're talking about here. I think what he's communicating is, I've got some discretionary funds and I give them. We're talking about beyond that. I cut into something else. I'm going to have to do without food. I'm not going to be able to pay this bill. I'm not going to be able to go someplace I was planning to go because of this gift. In other words, it's more than just what I could have given without it affecting my life. No, this cut into the rest of my life. I think that's what he means by this phrase as far as beyond their ability. Entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. Okay, I love the attitude here, but we also learn something here. It's not just that their motivation, they really wanted to. It just makes me think, you've seen people like this. A lot of you are probably people like this. But when the family gets together or people are doing something, you're that kind of person, or you've seen that kind of person that says, well, let me do something. I don't want to be the person who just sits here and watches everybody else work. I don't want to be that. No, let me pitch in and help somehow to make whatever happens. Whatever happens, happen. Whatever. Anyway, that's their attitude towards church. But look at the end of that fourth verse. He says there's also a service to the saints. So it's not just a giving. They are meeting a need. I want to throw this out right away, though. I do not think, personally, I really don't think that the Bible teaches that that's the number one reason to give. I think it is a reason to give. Somebody's got a need. Somebody's in a situation. By the way, specifically, what's the situation, the backdrop to this? Who are they taking this offering up for? Did I ever mention this? Who are they taking this up for?
Jerusalem.
Who?
Saints in Jerusalem.
Yeah, the saints. By the way, they're not sending an offering to Jerusalem. They're sending an offering to the saints in Jerusalem. What's the difference?
Believe it.
It's not going to the temple.
Yeah, okay. Let me just throw out a bunch of stuff, and if we need to talk about it, we'll talk about it. But do you notice in the Bible the emphasis on who you're supposed to give to? If there's a need that somebody has, top priority would be if you're a Christian and somebody that you're related to in your family. Guess what? The church is not supposed to take care of that if they're Christian family members. You're supposed to take care of your family. Now, widows are put on the list. Remember Paul talks about this, Timothy. They're put on the list. If there are no Christian family members to take care of, well, your church is your family. Okay? So if the family's not there, then the church takes care of it. And the church gives emphasis, first of all, family needs within the church, but also to Christians. And then, at a different level, would be giving and taking care of other people who have real needs, not just because they're asking for it. Remember what Paul tells the church in Thessalonica. You're also not supposed to give money to somebody who's not willing to work.
Amen.
Okay, I'll just take it one step more. You already know me, but and we've already talked about this. But I think it's actually, let me say it overstated. Okay, I think maybe it's an unchristian thing to do, to get money out of your pocket and give it to some of these guys standing on the street corner. I think some people are doing that because they think it's the Christian thing to do. I actually think that you might be violating one of the things God says to do. Unless you know that person. Because you might be contributing to the problem. Okay, let me come back to this text here. One of the things that we're doing is taking care of the saints. The saints. And this is an offering that they're taking up because there's been a severe famine in Jerusalem. And not just famine, persecution has broken out. A lot of people, there's references in the book of Hebrews, for example, that people lost their homes because of the persecution. There's been bloodshed sometimes. We know a lot about the persecution in the early church. And the rest of the church jumps in to help. Which, by the way, we find out some fascinating things from the church fathers because, yeah, family first, Christians give a priority there. But you know what? Giving in the community. You know where the church focused first on giving in the community? People who couldn't take care of themselves. And you remember the two classes of people who most couldn't take care of themselves in the first century?
Widows and fathers.
Widows and orphans. In fact, where would you find the orphans frequently? On the garbage heap. Because according to Roman law, a father could say, well, I don't want this one. And it was legal if they were young enough just to discard them. And the Christians would regularly go out, take care of them. In fact, I heard something recently. I was listening to a lecture on something totally different. This early church historian was talking about the fact that the church not only did that as far as helping out the orphans and the widows, people would be abandoned. The church also had a great reputation when some of the plagues broke out in the early centuries. Because people were scared to death, and people would abandon their own families if they thought they had the plague. They'd up and leave. And guess what? Christians would swoop in and take care of all these sick people. And it's kind of like, aren't you afraid of dying? And the Christians are like, actually, no. If I die doing this, that's something else. But it was a great opportunity to help other people. But the number one reason is because we want to worship God. We'll get to that in just a minute. And they did not do as we expected. This is verse 5. But they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will. I love this reminder. It's not just something you do. It's who you are. It's because I have been bought with a price. I'm not my own. I want to glorify God with who I am, with my body, with everything God's given me. So you give yourself first, and then when there are opportunities to give with some of your resources, you're able to do that too. But giving can take place as far as working for somebody else, doing something. There's a lot of different ways to give. We are talking about financial offering giving here, though. Okay, verse 6. So we urge Titus, since he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. By the way, the most generic definition of the word grace is what? A gift. It means giving. Okay? And what is he saying? He's saying, we're encouraging Titus. Why Titus? Because Titus has been the one, remember, he's been working with the Corinthians, and he comes back and gives a report to Paul. What's his encouragement? Well, they started off good. In other words, the financial picture probably looks like this. It's going up and down. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. And what he's saying is, listen, Titus, stay on top of this, because they made some good plans. They were sincere. They really wanted to do this. Just kind of fallen off track. We'll get into that a little bit more too, because he's going to come back to that subject. Verse 7. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. Okay, I know the Corinthian church had a lot of problems, but I don't think Paul is buttering them up. I think he's being very sincere here. What do you know about the gifts in the church at Corinth? Wow! They had all sorts of spiritual gifts. What conclusion did we come to between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which, by the way, is less than a year? Probably half, 3/4 of a year between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, right? The kind of letter that Paul sent in 1 Corinthians, you compare that to 2 Corinthians, what do we guess happened?
They fixed most of the problems.
They probably did address these things, because he doesn't have to mention them again, by and large. What he does have to mention is some of the personal attacks in 2 Corinthians, but not so much the issue. They probably stopped suing each other. They probably stopped. They did definitely kick this guy out. He needed to be kicked out, the sexual incest issue, right? And they probably stopped the divisions and everything else. So what he's saying here is probably, you know what, you guys are doing really well. You made some mistakes, but you know what? You corrected those mistakes. You're growing. I'm proud of you. You're doing well in a lot of areas, but you know what? This giving thing. Your heart was in the right place, but it kind of fell off, so let's bring that up to speed. Okay? Let me see. I am not, verse 8, I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. This is where I make the reference to Acts chapter 5. It's verse 4. It's verse 4. He says, I'm not saying you have to do this, but you know what? If you're very sincere, this is one of the natural things that's going to happen. It's up to you as far as how much you're going to give. Your money, God has allowed you to be in control of your money. So this is a free will kind of thing. Verse 9, for you know the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. You talk about going to the number one example of somebody who sacrificed. So he gave a local example just north of the Macedonian church is where he starts out. Now he goes to Jesus. He says, think about what Jesus gave up. Okay, so that should motivate us to want to make some sort of sacrifices in our life too. Verse 10. And here is my advice about what is best for you in this matter. Last year, so probably making reference back to the time in 1 Corinthians, last year you were first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Okay, so maybe they did well at giving for a while there. Maybe it fell off, but maybe their want, their sincerity, their desire, maybe it was right there. In fact, he's going to come back and mention that again at the beginning of the 9th chapter. He's going to talk about, wow, you know what? Your heart was there. In fact, just a guess, but I think there's some hints here that maybe at least some of the people in Corinth, it wasn't because they didn't want to give, it's because they weren't really good at managing their money. You know, some people are real good at planning things out. Other people, man, I want to give, and they look at their checkbook, it's like, oh, what happened to the money? I wanted to do this, and it's as though, okay, your heart's in the right place. You just need some help. You just need some help. Makes me think of, there have been several different guys that have had financial ministries, and it's along these lines of, sometimes it's to help people understand what God says, but a lot of times it's not just that. It's like Dave Ramsey comes to mind, and it's this idea of, okay, maybe you already know what you need to do, and your heart's in the right place. You just don't know how to do this. So let me help you make a budget so you can pay your bills and do what you have to do, but also are able to set aside on a regular basis some money to do what your heart wants to do. I kind of think that's part of what Titus is supposed to do here. Help them be able to better manage, which I know I've told some of you guys this before. Makes me so proud. One of the things that I have so appreciated about the elders here, there have been many times where we don't publicly talk about this, but I do want you to know there have been many times where we have financially helped out people in the church and people who are associated with people in the church. But almost every time, maybe every time, because I'm not in the loop all the time, but just about every time I know of it, they sit down and they talk with people. The elders sit down and talk with people. Because we don't just want to throw money at this. We want to make sure you know how to handle your money. So yeah, we're willing to help you, but helping is not just giving somebody money. It's also sitting down and, I'm sorry, this classic case comes to my mind. We had a family that's been years ago, couldn't pay their mortgage. Church paid their mortgage for it. But the church also sat down and said, you're paying 13% interest on your mortgage payment now. And at that time, they could have gotten, 3%? But they had a friend at the bank who set up the loan for them, and they didn't want to hurt their friend's feelings. Yeah. And we're like, But when I say we, what I meant, the elders were saying it, and I was in the background, we're cheering them on. But I so appreciate that, because we're not just talking about throwing money at stuff, or we're not just talking about trying to get people to give. This is a bigger picture of who you are and making plans and being prepared to do what God wants you to do, because you want to give your whole life to God. But part of that as a Christian would be your giving. Where did I leave off? Verse 11? Is that where we are? Verse 11? Now finish the work, because they already had the desire to do it. So he says, finish the work so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by the completion of it according to your means. In fact, you already get the point that he says you wanted to do this, but you need to follow through, right? You've already had I filled out the form, I made the promise, I'm going to give this much money to God. But now it's like, oh boy, I made the promise. Where's the money going to come from? He says, you've got to make some plans to be able to do this. Verse 12, for the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Okay, tell me if I'm wrong, but doesn't that sound like, in interest of full disclosure, I have heard people say that you ought to make a promise to give God some money, and you don't even have the money. But go ahead and make the promise anyway, and you know what? God's going to bless you with that money, and you can just go ahead and give it. Doesn't that seem to contradict what this says? You've heard things like that, haven't you? People all the time are saying, we used to have faith promise programs, and one of the things they used to say is, it's faith. You just say, I'm going to give all this money. You don't have that money. That's okay. Have faith that you're going to. Well, let's have faith in what God says, and let's look at what this verse says. He says, not do according to what one has, not according to what he does not have. You're not responsible for what you don't have. You are responsible for what you do have. You have to be good stewards of that. Okay, he's going to come back to that idea again too. Verse 13. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. Oh, I think that is so important. He's not saying, I want you to go in debt to take care of the people in Jerusalem. It's not what you don't have. But what you can give so that they might be taken care of. And I'm not asking you to give so that they can live a lifestyle that you can't live. I'm asking that there be equality. And right now they're hurting. And you're not hurting. You have some ability here. Doesn't this also kind of fly in the face of some guys on TV who want people to give them enough money so they can fly around in their own jet? Yeah. Then that, where's the equality there? Okay. Yeah, Thomas.
I got a question.
Sure.
But in the giving, if you feel guilty when it's like you're helping somebody and then there's somebody else there that needs that help also, but you feel guilty when you can only help. How do we handle that?
I don't know. Obviously, the reason I say I don't know is because there are so many different specifics here. I really don't know exactly what you're talking about. I do understand that, sometimes it tugs at your heartstrings. It's kind of like, man, I want to support that mission. I want to help this person. I want to take care of that need. And you don't have all the money to give to every single thing here. But you have to give to something. And I think the biblical principle here is, yeah, we're going to help out Christians in time of need. But our number one giving is giving to God. It's an act of worship. Paul's already talked about in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter. It's also giving to God's people, missionaries, teachers, support the church. That's an assumption too. There's a lot of different places to give. And the need's always going to be out there for that. But even if the need's not there, we're giving it to God, number one. Yeah, great.
Well, I'm thinking that's why if all of us are giving money to the church, to the saints, to help those, the church can help both. I might not be able to, but all of us together can. And that's one of the reasons that's why we don't go it alone, trying to figure out who to give to and what.
I don't mean to embarrass Dennis, but I always think of finances. I think of Dennis. He's been a great resource for me. He understands budgeting stuff a whole lot better than me. He did a study once when he was on the eldership here, and he said, if the number of people attending service here at Merritt Island, which, by the way, I want you to know this, we're way above the national average. Proportionately, percentage-wise, what people give, we have a good giving church. Having said that, Dennis figured out that if everybody was just breaking even as far as the poverty rate was concerned at that time and was giving 10%, our offerings would have gone up. See, it's so nice as a preacher not knowing who gives what, because that would be cumbersome. So, okay, did I miss another hand? Charlie.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that when we give it to the church, God uses it to the best way possible, I think.
Yeah, okay. It does put extra,
Responsibility.
yeah, it puts extra weight on the people who are making up the budget and deciding how the money is going to be spent when the offerings come in. And that's where I think this principle here about, we're not asking you to give so that you can suffer and somebody else can be better off. That's why I'm always thankful that when they look at staff salaries and things like that, is staff should not be living above the standards of everybody else in church. I think that violates what's going on here. There is a lot of responsibility as far as making the decisions, but let's get back to here because there's so much more that I kind of want us to deal with this in a whole group, a whole clump if we can. Verse 13? 14, thank you. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. Now that might be a reference to the fact that once they get through the famine and everything else, there might be a time where they're going to send you enough. Maybe. But you know what? Maybe they're never going to be in that financial situation. They can bless you in some other way. It's not always money for money. And I want us to keep that in the back of our minds too when we get to chapter 9, when he talks about whatever you give, you'll receive. Doesn't mean you give financially, you're going to receive financially necessarily. Okay, but they'll supply your need. Then there will be equality, as it is written, he who had gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. What's that a reference to?
Manna.
That's manna. That's exactly right. People went out there and tried to take more than they should. What happened to that manna overnight?
Rotted.
Yeah, maggots. So this idea of equality, this is where I really like Haggai, the first chapter. Do you know the context, the setting for the book of Haggai? Haggai is sent to the post-exilic people. They've come back from the exile. They've come back from Babylon. But they haven't built the temple yet. But you know what they have done? They've built their own homes. And that's okay. But you know what they're doing now? They're doing renovations to their own homes. They're doing stage 2. And they still haven't gotten around to taking care of the temple. And so God sends Haggai to the people. And I love this first chapter. Look at Haggai chapter 1. That's the context. They're taking care of themselves, but they haven't prioritized God's work in there. And so here's what he says, verse 5. Haggai chapter 1, verse 5. He says, now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but there's never enough. You drink, but you do not have your fill. You put clothes on, but you are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in pockets with holes in them. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying, you know what? You are never going to get ahead. You know why? God's not going to let you get ahead. You know why? Because you haven't set your priorities straight. God has to come first in your life. You can work as hard as you want. If you fall into this trap, as soon as I get financially set, then I'll give. Oh boy, you can never do that. That's why I love families that start their little people off. If they get an allowance or they get paid for doing something or whatever, 50 cents, dollar, I don't know what the allowance is.
I'm sure it's $5 now.
Whatever it is, sit down with the kids and say, okay, what are you going to give to God? What are you going to give?
Anyway.
Why? If you have this idea, well, they don't make enough money yet. Oh, again, sorry for telling these old stories, but when we were in Caracas, they were starting a new church in a little seaside village, and they said it was just dirt poor. They were telling us about the work and how they needed help. We were happy to help, but we asked the question, what are they giving? They said, oh, well, we don't take an offering from them. They're just dirt poor. And we said, we'll help you, but you have to take up an offering. You have to take up an offering. What's the principle here? Turn to Leviticus chapter 5 with me real quick. Leviticus chapter 5. I know we've made reference to this before too, but I love this principle. Leviticus, the 5th chapter, he talks about, let's pick up reading in verse 5. Leviticus 5, verse 5. He says, if anyone is guilty in any of these ways, he must confess in the way that he has sinned, and the penalty for the sin that he has committed, he must bring to the Lord a female lamb or goat from the flock as a sin offering, and the priest will make atonement for him. Verse 7, if he cannot afford a lamb, he is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons. So if you can't afford the lamb, guess what? Make an allowance for you. You can bring the birds, right? Skip on down to verse 11. If, however, he cannot afford the 2 doves or the 2 pigeons, he is to bring an offering of the sin, the 1/10 of an ephah. What's that? It's a grain offering. So here's what he says. You're supposed to bring the lamb or the goat. You can't do that. You can bring birds. Can't bring birds? Then go ahead and bring grain. What about the person who couldn't bring grain? Thank you. Because the law of the land was you weren't allowed to harvest all the field. You had to leave the corners and the edges along the pathways. Why? So people who couldn't afford, didn't have anything, they could go out, or somebody in their family could go out and work. I love that. I love that. Giving them it's taking care of them welfare-wise, but welfare-wise by working for it. So you can't afford the lamb, that's okay. You can bring birds, which, by the way, birds are dirt cheap. But you know what? Sometimes you just can't afford that. So bring grain. Can't afford grain? Get up. Go get that grain. Right, sorry. Don't want to sound too caustic. Let's come back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So, by the way, that's same idea, right? Everybody has to give. It's just proportionate. You don't have to give what you don't have, but you do have to give. Okay, verse 16, I thank God who put into the heart of Titus the same concern as I have for you. The Apostle Paul has already talked about how he feels like he is their spiritual father, how his heart breaks for them, and he says, you know what, Titus feels the same way. Titus is the guy who helped them work with this, on this matter of giving before, and he's encouraging them to be open to Titus as he continues this work. Verse 17, for Titus not only welcomed our appeal, but he is coming to you with much enthusiasm on his own initiative. So it's not just Paul's encouragement. Titus actually wants to do this. Verse 18, and we are sending along with them the brother. So we've got Titus. Titus has already been there and come back with a report. Titus is going back. There's also the brother. Who is this brother? Obviously well enough known that you didn't have to use the name. He doesn't use the name. The brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. I think it was a first century Dave Ramsey. But another guy who has a good reputation. And we're on this subject of giving, right? Verse 19. What is more, he was chosen by the churches to accompany us as we carry the offerings which we administer in order to show honor to the Lord himself and to show our eagerness to help. This offering, they do want to help, but notice how it's because they're Christians, they want to honor God, but go back up to the beginning part of the verse, guess what? He's there to accompany us. Why? Because we want to do this above board. We want to do this above board. Boy, I so appreciate credibility. When Paul takes up this offering, there are people that have been selected by the churches, and they accompany the offering too. So there are a lot of people there, so nobody's doing this by themselves. The few times, I bet you everybody's heard a horror story or two. I bet you everybody's heard a horror story or two about money in the church. Somebody was tempted, and they have the ability to get their hands on the money. That's why we always make the practice of there's 2 people involved in collecting the money. There's checks and balances as far as the people who count the money are not the people who write the checks. So we try to do stuff like that because this credibility issue is huge. Every time in my 30-ish years in the ministry, those occasions where, you know what, there wasn't 2 people, there was only 1 person. I'm sad to say, I think every time that's happened, we tried to address it. But when we tried to address it, the person got their feelings hurt. What, you just don't trust me? No, it's because I care about you. I don't want you put in that position. But people take it personally sometimes, and it's like, sorry. Don't want to put you in that position. We need to have accountability. So Titus is coming, this brother that they refer to. We want to look at what he says in verse 20. We want to avoid criticism in the way we administer this liberal gift. We want to avoid the criticism. We want to be above board. For we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of men. Yes, you stand before God. That's the one you really have to answer to. But you know what? If you want to please God, you got to be concerned about your reputation too. And boy, this money thing. So many times people think here in church, they think this is our lesson every week. we talk about money all the time because that's all we want. It's a terrible misconception. But it is part of the picture. Verse 22, in addition, we are sending with them our brother who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous, and now even more so because of the great confidence we have in you. Verse 23, as for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brothers, plural, they are representatives of the churches and an honor to Christ. Therefore, show these men, plural, we've got the brothers, the brother, singular, and we've got Titus. So we've got a group of several people. Therefore, show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. There is no need for me to write to you about this service to the saints, for I know your eagerness to help, and I have been boasting about it to the Macedonians. Okay, again, their heart's in the right place. They're eager. They want to do it. Telling them that since last year, you in Achaia, so that would be Athens and Corinth down there, he says, you in Achaia were ready to give, and your enthusiasm has stirred most of them to action. So their enthusiasm actually motivated the people of Macedonia. Now he's pointing to the example of the people of Macedonia, asking that to motivate them to get on the ball, right? So they made the pledge. They had the desire. Verse 3, but I am sending the brothers. Just got through mentioning this group, right? He's sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you in this matter should not prove hollow, but that you may be ready as I said you would be. Doesn't this sound like, man, you guys had great plans. So we're sending some people over from CFR, Christian Financial Resources, to help you with budgeting. Because, you know, the desire of what you wanted to give is just not coming through. So we're gonna help you out with this, so you can do what you want to do. Verse 4, for any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to say anything about you, would be ashamed of having been so confident. Boy, wouldn't it be sad? You made all these great plans, but somehow, some way, you mishandled your money. And so he says, I just want to help you with that. So, verse 5, so I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to visit you in advance and to finish the arrangements for the generous gift you had promised. Then you will be ready as a generous gift, not as one, to give it as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given. He's going to come back to this subject. If you wait and you don't manage your money well, and it's time to give the offering, and then it's kind of like, oh boy, now I've got to sell the car and everything to give what I said I'd give, then you're probably not going to give it with the right heart. By the way, one of the principles, I should have mentioned this a long time ago, one of the principles he says is make sure in your giving, set it aside every week. In other words, regularly setting it aside. Isn't that budgeting? Budget. You want to come through? Budget. There's an interesting thing here. This is just a footnote, but I find this so interesting. This word for gift, he uses it twice here in this 5th verse. It's the same word from which we get the English word eulogy. It's the exact same word. What's a eulogy? Okay.
Well spoken.
It's like
Well said.
Comes from.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, it comes from 2 Greek words. Good word. Say the good word. If anybody ever asks you to do a eulogy, it means you're supposed to say something good about the person. That's a eulogy. Okay. The term for eulogy, meaning good word, saying a good word on somebody's behalf, came to be used to mean any kind of blessing, not just something you say. Bless somebody. Make them happy you were there. And he's using that expression to say, you know what? Your blessing can be your offering. your offering can help them. Remember this. Remember this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously. What's he talking about? He's talking about your giving. Flip over to Luke chapter 6 for just a second. This is one of the things Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Another classic verse. Luke 6:38. Give, and it will be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. It will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The measure you use, it will be measured to you. Okay, it's called the law of the harvest. You can't expect a huge crop if you only plant a handful of seed. Right? And he's saying one of the ways that you can spiritually bless your own life is to be a person who's not concerned about your own life. You're concerned about worshiping God and meeting other people's needs. Galatians 6:7 also, this reap what you sow. This law of the harvest is also mentioned there. Each man, verse 7, each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves, what kind of giver?
Hilarious.
What's that word? Hilarious. Hilarious. Most people don't think of hilarity when you think of how in the world. If you put this together, though, I think even if you didn't know the Greek words here, I think it would make sense, because you start back there at the beginning of the 8th chapter, and it's kind of like they were eager. Let us, come on, you're going to take up an offering and you didn't tell us. Come on, we want to participate in that. It's kind of like, wow, what an opportunity. It's like telling somebody else, man, it was great. I made it before they took up the offering. Okay, it's that eager desire. It's that kind of desire. It's the joy of your heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion. I know you've heard this story too before. A lot of you have. Years ago, we made the decision at this congregation to stop passing the offering plate. This was the verse why. Because of this verse. A lot of people get it. But some people were very concerned, especially people visiting the church. It's kind of like visiting the church. Here, we're glad you're here. Here's an offering plate. Doesn't that sound like we want your money? Right? So we didn't want to do that. We don't want anybody grudgingly. In fact, you have to make an effort. You have to go find an offering box. And usually nobody else is going to be standing around to watch you. We're not going to clang the cymbals when we see you put your check in.
Right. You'd have to download the app in order to find them. No.
But when we did that here at the congregation, you know what happened to our offerings? They went up. They went up. I think there's a reason for that. I really think there's a reason for that. Okay, not reluctantly, under compulsion. God loves a cheerful giver. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all you need, you will abound in every good work. You will do what? Abound in every good work. He's going to quote from Psalm 112 here. I don't want to forget verse 8. We're going to come back to it, but I want to read a little bit more. He says, quoting Psalm 12, He has scattered abroad His gifts to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. Now He who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply the increased store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be made rich in every way so that you can be generous. Okay, this law of the harvest and what he talks about here as far as God taking care of you so that you will abound in every good work. You will receive so that you will be able to be generous. It's not the mentality, I'm going to give a lot of money to the church. Why? Because God's going to bless me. Then I'll be rich. No, you won't. If you get this, you give, and God will bless you so that you can keep on giving it. That's the principle he's saying. Having said that, there are a lot of different ways that God blesses. There are so many different stories that comes to mind. There's Gabe is going to go do mission work at Mizzou, up in Missouri. The guy who was there for years and years, Roy Weiss, One of the illustrations he used to use was, I'm quite sure he gave proportionately, he's just that kind of guy, probably gave half of what he had, I don't know.
More
Just
than
a
that.
big giver. You know what? Wasn't a rich guy though. But you know what? His cars never had trouble. He would get like 300,000-400,000 miles in a car, and everybody's like, how in the world is your car still good? Well, you know what? I think that's this principle. I think that's this principle. God takes care. When you put God first. So it's not this, I told you I heard the offering meditation once where somebody was, do you guys know what an offering meditation is? Sorry. Guy said, you want that new car? Here you go. We're going to take. No, giving is to give to God, and if the blessings come back, when they come back, so that we can continue to give. Okay. So that you will be generous on every occasion, and through us, this generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of God's people, notice again the emphasis on the saints, supplying the needs of God's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Wow, you know what? This is part of our worship to God. This is part of our getting out the message as far as our relationship with God and people understanding what's really important. Verse 13, because of this service by which you have proved yourselves, men will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone else. I've got a little note in my Bible. This just reminds me, years ago, I was talking to a guy, almost scary to talk to guy, wasn't a Christian at the time. He later on became a Christian, but at the time. But he said, you know what? He said, if I really believed that stuff, if I really believed it, he said, I would live a totally different life. He said, this guy wasn't a Christian, but he says, what I don't understand is some of the people who say they believe this and they live lives just like me. He had a real point. He had a real point. Because if this stuff is true, it's true. If it's true, it's true. That means that this life has nothing to compare with what we're looking forward to. In fact, this life is an opportunity to draw closer to God and help other people do the same thing. Shame on us if we get sidetracked. Just makes me think of my dear friend Nate Schnauz was in Panama for a year, and he had some friends come down to help him do the work. And he said one of his good buddies, a farmer in southern Illinois, came back after spending several weeks in Panama helping with, by the way, not Panama City, this was up on the mountains, Buquete, the area. They were working with some of the reservations in the back part of Panama. Anyway, he came home, and this guy's a hard-working farmer, but you know what? He had been saving up money, and when he came home, he was going to put the brick facade on his house. After spending that time in the mission field, he came home and he looked at his house and he says, I'm a fool. What in the world am I doing this for? Well, you know what? If you're doing a rehab on your house, that's fine. I'm not saying it for that purposes. I'm just saying it for the idea that it just really hit him. I'm not living with eternity in mind. I'm just so sucked into the here and now. And so I think it was a real growing experience. Last verse, a couple verses here. He says, and in their prayers for you, in their hearts will go out to you because of the surpassing grace God has given you. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift. What is God's indescribable gift?
So,
Yeah, there's many different ways you can say this. It's Jesus. It's Jesus who makes us right with God, who gives us an eternity. He's putting this, I think He's coming back and putting this all into eternal perspective. I've got a couple more minutes, so I wanted to deal with this Romans 12 passage. Turn over to Romans chapter 12. Does somebody else have a question or comment while we're turning there?
I just got one question.
Sure.
Based on what you just taught tonight, it appears that maybe what I'm doing it in a wrong standard.
As far as
because I do all I can to feed and supply the homeless with food, clothes, the word, medications, and so on and so forth. And oftentimes I go broke doing it. However, it's hard pressed to get Christians to say, okay, I'll help you, because they're like, no, we don't do that. I've talked to several pastors,
Yeah.
and they were all talking, oh, this church don't do that.
Yeah.
And so I graciously and happily, I got to go through the okay, no problem, I'll go broke doing it. You know, I give my last doing it.
Yeah.
And my Christian friends, they often call me late night and says, you're a fool. Because God doesn't want you to go broke to help somebody else. And then I'm like, well, nobody else is helping me help. What do I do?
Yeah, you bring so many things to mind. There are many different ways to help people, and a lot of times it's not just by giving them money.
No, I don't give them. I never give them money. I always
That's
feed
great.
them.
Which, by the way, having said that, you know what? Sometimes we do need to give money to some people. But sometimes, especially when what you're talking about, I would think you'd have to be very, very, very careful. Because sometimes what they need is the food, not the money. In fact, one of the principles that we have for dollars for deeds, when people come in with a need, you know what? Sorry, Dennis. Dennis and the people who take care of this, you know what they do? They say, okay, you need that bill paid. Give us the address, give us the thing, we'll pay to them. But you know what? Sometimes we're hurting somebody when we give them money to pay their bill, because a lot of times that's the reason they got into trouble in the first place, because they don't have self-control. They're going to spend it on something else they don't need to spend it on, or sometimes a bad habit. And so meeting the need is not always money directly to that person. But let's get this last verse or two in context here, because this kind of goes with what we're talking about too. Romans chapter 12 is this classic passage about, just like the Macedonian churches, you give yourself first, right? You present your bodies as living sacrifices. You're not your own. You're living your whole life for God, right? Skip on down here to verse, verse 6. We have many different gifts according to the grace that God has given us. If a man's gift is prophecy, by the way, when we talk about gifts, most people automatically go to abilities, right? Special abilities. That's one kind of gift. What's another kind of gift that God gives? Opportunities. Please keep that in mind. Sometimes a gift is not, it is, because you're able to do something that other people aren't able to do. But you know what? Sometimes your gift is, you're the one there. Right? You're the one sitting by the guy at work who's asking the question about the Lord. It's kind of like, well, my gift is not teaching. Well, I'm sorry. This is your gift because you're there and he's asking and you're a Christian, right? Keep that in mind as we look at this. There are many different gifts according to the grace that God has given. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion to his faith. If his gift is serving, let him serve. If it's teaching, let him teach. If it's encouraging, let him encourage. If it's what? Contributing, giving to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it's leadership, let him govern diligently. If it's showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. The reason I wanted to read this whole thing, are the people who have this natural knack for being merciful, are they the only ones who are supposed to be merciful? No. Not everybody's a leader, but you know what? Just about everybody's put in a position where you got to lead somebody. Not everybody's a teacher, but everybody's put in that position sometimes where you have to help somebody else understand something about God, right? We all have to give, but guess what? Some people have a real knack for this. Some people have a real knack for this, as far as God has really blessed them financially. And so that's their thing. They give. Part of it is not just because they have the opportunity, because God has blessed them financially. Part of it's because this very thing we're talking about. They realize that, you know what, this person needs money. That person is poor and everything else, but they don't need money. It's going to make matters worse. And some people have that kind of discretion to know. We have to be givers, but that doesn't always mean money to everybody who, especially everybody who asks for it. Yeah. Okay, and, I'm out of time. The other one I was going to use was The passage is 1 Timothy chapter 6. I don't even think I wrote it up here. 1 Timothy chapter 6, where it says, the love of money, not money, the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. The reason it's so important to talk about the love of money is that you may not have any money at all, but you still have the love of money. So it's getting things all mixed up. We've got to keep the eternal perspective. Thanks to God for His indescribable gift. Guess what? We've got eternity waiting for us. So right now it's just an opportunity. One of the ways that we can help with that is giving, in whatever way that we can to help with the Lord's work, to help that God has a good reputation here, and to meet the needs of people who have those needs. Let's pray. Gracious Heavenly